The first thing I noticed wasn't the trees, it was the light. That's what still sticks with me years later. I pulled into my driveway after work one October evening, and the whole backyard looked wrong, brighter somehow, like somebody had peeled away a layer of the landscape while I was gone. At first I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, painting everything gold, and for a few seconds I just sat there in my truck staring out the windshield, feeling that strange little tug in your gut that tells you something's off before your brain catches up. Then I stepped out, shut the door, and walked toward the back of my property. About halfway across the yard, I stopped cold. My trees were gone. Not all of them, but enough. The long row of maples and cedar trees that had stood along the rear boundary of my land for nearly 20 years looked like they'd survived a surgical attack. One entire side of the canopy had been carved away. Branches as thick as my arm were missing. Fresh cuts gleamed pale against the dark bark. Sap still dripped from some of them. Somebody had done this that morning. Somebody had stood on my property and decided they had the right to reshape it. I remember just standing there listening to the wind move through what was left of those trees, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a utility company. Maybe storm preparation. Maybe some permit I didn't know about. But the more I looked, the worse it got. Every cut faced uphill. Every single one. Whoever did it wasn't trying to save the trees. They were creating a view. Behind my property sat a neighborhood called Silver Hollow Estates, one of those gated developments that seem to appear overnight when enough investors discover a hillside. 5 years earlier, the ridge had been covered with oak trees and deer trails. Now it was lined with oversized houses, giant windows, outdoor fireplaces, infinity pools, and people who loved posting sunset photos online. I had never had a problem with any of them. We waved occasionally. We kept to ourselves. That was how I liked it. My wife, Emily, used to joke that I bought this land because I enjoyed talking to trees more than people. Maybe she wasn't completely wrong. She passed away 3 years before all this happened, and after that the property became more than land to me. It became the last place that still felt like home. Every tree she planted, every flower bed she designed, every quiet corner where we'd sit and drink coffee on Saturday mornings, all of it mattered. So when I saw those branches scattered across the ground, it felt personal in a way I couldn't immediately explain. That night, I skipped dinner and pulled up my security footage instead. Around 10:14 that morning, a white utility truck entered through the old maintenance path behind my acreage. 2 men climbed out wearing bright safety vests. No company logo. No identifying markings. No paperwork. Nothing. They unloaded chainsaws and got straight to work. What caught my attention wasn't that they were cutting trees. It was how comfortable they looked doing it. There was no hesitation, no checking maps, no discussion about property lines. They moved like people who believed they had permission. I watched the footage 3 times, then 4, then 5. By midnight I had screenshots, timestamps, and a license plate number written on a yellow legal pad beside my coffee cup. The next morning I drove uphill to Silver Hollow Estates. The entrance looked exactly like you'd expect. Stone walls, decorative fountains, a polished bronze sign. Everything expensive enough to remind visitors they didn't belong there. I pressed the call button and asked to speak with someone from the Homeowners Association. An hour later, I found myself sitting inside a spotless office across from a woman named Denise Mercer, the HOA community manager. She had perfect hair, a perfect smile, and framed photographs of sunsets hanging behind her desk. The irony wasn't lost on me. I explained what happened. I showed her photos. I showed her screenshots from my cameras. She listened politely, folded her hands, and gave me a smile that somehow made me even angrier. We were under the impression those trees were part of a shared growth area, she said. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Well, I said, sliding my property survey across her desk, you were under the wrong impression. Her smile tightened. Several homeowners expressed concerns about obstructed valley views. I looked at her for a moment and said, "That's unfortunate." She blinked. "Excuse me. Your homeowner's views are not my responsibility." For the first time the room got quiet. Then she offered reimbursement for trimming expenses, like this was some landscaping misunderstanding that could be solved with a check. I remember leaning back in my chair and asking one simple question. Do you know how long it takes to grow privacy? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because the truth was she wasn't talking about trees anymore, and neither was I. Walking back to my truck, I had the feeling this story wasn't actually about the damage they'd already done. It was about something they hadn't realized I'd noticed yet. And over the next few days, as I started examining the ridge more carefully, I discovered something that changed the entire fight. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Denise had said. Not because it made sense, but because it didn't. People don't accidentally send a crew onto somebody else's property with chainsaws. That takes planning. Somebody approved it. Somebody paid for it. Somebody expected to get away with it. The more I thought about it, the less interested I became in the actual damage, and the more interested I became in understanding how they had convinced themselves it was acceptable. So every morning before work, I'd grab a cup of coffee and walk the rear edge of my land. It became a routine. Just me, the trees, and a lot of unanswered questions. Then on the third morning, I noticed something I should have seen years earlier. With part of the canopy gone, I suddenly had a clear view of the ridge above me. Specifically, the security cameras. At first I counted 3, then 5, then 7. The more I looked, the more I found. They were mounted along the entire rear boundary of Silver Hollow Preserve, fixed to poles positioned just inside HOA property. What caught my attention wasn't the cameras themselves. It was where they were pointed. None faced neighborhood roads. None monitored the clubhouse. None covered the community pool. Every single lens pointed downhill, toward private land, toward me. I stopped and stared at one particular camera for nearly a minute. It had a direct line of sight into the upper floor of my house. My stomach tightened. Suddenly, the tree trimming felt different. Before, it had been about views. Now it felt like something else entirely. Access, visibility, control. That afternoon, my neighbor Hank drove over in his old Ford pickup. Hank had lived next door for nearly 20 years and knew every roomer within 10 miles. I showed him the camera positions. He adjusted his hat and squinted uphill. "Well, I'll be damned. You seeing what I'm seeing?" I asked. "Yep. Think that's normal?" Hank laughed. "Depends. You asking a lawyer or a normal person?" We both laughed, but neither of us thought it was funny. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. Folks with money sometimes start believing property lines are suggestions. The next morning, I hired a surveyor. Not because I thought I was wrong. I knew I wasn't. I wanted proof so clear that nobody could wiggle around it later. The surveyor, a gray-haired guy named Martin Cole, spent 2 days reviewing everything. Old plats, county records, boundary markers, easements, historical surveys. By Monday morning, bright orange stakes appeared along the property line like little warning flags. That's when things got interesting. Within an hour, people from the ridge started appearing on their balconies. I could practically feel them watching. A woman stood with a pair of binoculars. A man walked his dog back and forth 3 separate times. Another homeowner stood beside his outdoor fireplace, pretending to check his phone while staring directly at my property. Apparently, curiosity traveled fast uphill. Around noon, Martin handed me the final survey packet. He tapped the boundary line with his finger. "You're clean." "How clean?" I asked. "Not even close. Those trees were entirely yours. Every one of them." I nodded. "And the cameras?" He looked uphill. "Not my department, but if I owned this property, I'd be asking questions." That afternoon, I called Susan Keller, my attorney. Susan had the rare ability to sound friendly while simultaneously making people regret their decisions. After reviewing the footage and survey documents, she was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "This may be bigger than they realize." Meaning somebody got comfortable. Very comfortable. Certified letters went out the next morning. Formal notice regarding property damage. Requests to preserve communications. Requests to identify contractors. Requests regarding surveillance equipment. Nothing dramatic. Just enough paperwork to make every lawyer involved sit up straight. 2 days later, my phone rang. Victor Langley, HOA president. The man introduced himself with the confidence of somebody used to getting his way. "Mr. Carter, I understand there have been concerns." "Concerns?" I almost laughed. "You mean the part where someone cut my trees?" "I think emotions are running high." "You think?" "Our community values cooperation." Funny way of showing it. He paused. Several residents invested heavily in homes with premium valley views. There it was. Finally. The truth. Not shared growth. Not misunderstanding. Not confusion. Money. Somebody bought $1 million view and decided my trees were the problem. "Victor," I said calmly, "when I bought this property, nobody sold me your view. And when your residents bought their homes, nobody sold them my trees. Silence. Then he tried a different angle. We're willing to discuss compensation. For 20 years of growth. Another silence. We can be reasonable. Then start by explaining why your cameras point into my bedroom. That one landed. Hard. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Finally he replied, those cameras are installed for security purposes. Then why aren't they watching your neighborhood? The conversation ended shortly afterward. But something had changed. For the first time, I heard uncertainty in his voice. That's when I made my decision. A lawsuit would eventually solve the problem. A legal battle might even result in damages. But there was another solution available immediately. One that was completely legal, completely straightforward, and impossible to argue against. Property rights work both ways. If somebody insists on enjoying the benefits of boundaries, they also have to accept the limitations those boundaries create. Thursday morning, 3 contractor trucks rolled onto my property. Friday morning, steel posts arrived. Saturday morning, workers began setting panels. By Sunday afternoon, the ridge was buzzing with activity. Homeowners gathered on patios watching construction through sunglasses and wine glasses. Nobody came down to ask what was happening. They already knew. By Monday morning, the first section stood complete. 8 feet tall. Solid steel. No gaps. No visibility. No opportunity for cameras to see through. No accidental overlooking. Just a clean, legal barrier built exactly on my side of the surveyed line. My phone exploded. Denise called first. Victor called second. 2 board members called after that. One resident somehow got my number and left a voicemail about preserving community aesthetics. Apparently aesthetics were very important now. Victor sounded particularly upset. This fence is extreme. Really? I asked. It's affecting dozens of homeowners. Interesting. The chainsaws affected me. The community is concerned. The community should have been concerned before entering private property. His voice tightened. You're escalating this situation. No, Victor. I'm defining it. The fence continued growing. Panel after panel. Section after section. Every camera angle disappeared. Every line of sight vanished. Every sunset view that depended on looking through my property ended. By Wednesday, technicians appeared near the camera poles. By Thursday, ladders were up. Equipment was coming down. By Friday, several cameras had already been relocated. That's when Susan called. I could hear amusement in her voice. Well, she said, their attorney finally returned my call. And, let's just say they're suddenly very interested in resolving matters. What changed? She laughed softly. My guess? Somebody finally explained liability. That evening I sat on my back porch with a beer and watched the sunset. For the first time all week, I felt calm. The ridge above me was unusually quiet. No people standing on balconies. No binoculars. No curious spectators. Just silence. Then, right as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I saw a familiar white utility truck turning slowly into my driveway. The same truck from my security footage. The same truck whose license plate I'd written down weeks earlier. Only this time, instead of chainsaws, the men climbing out were carrying folders, documents, and what looked suspiciously like an apology. I watched the truck roll to a stop, and for a moment I just sat there in my chair, beer in hand, staring at it. Funny how a vehicle can look completely different depending on who's stepping out of it. The first time I'd seen that truck, the men climbing out carried chainsaws and confidence. This time they carried folders and uncertainty. Neither looked particularly excited to be there. The taller one walked up the driveway, removed his cap, and knocked on my front door. When I opened it, he immediately extended his hand. Mr. Carter, my name's Ben. We worked that tree job a few weeks ago. I know exactly who you are. His face tightened a little. Fair enough. The other man shifted awkwardly beside him. Ben handed me a thick folder. Inside was a complete restoration proposal. Arborist reports. Soil recovery plans. Irrigation upgrades. Species replacement schedules. Maintenance guarantees. Inspection timelines. Everything professionally prepared and reviewed by attorneys. I flipped through several pages before looking back up. This is a lot of effort. Ben nodded. The HOA wants to make things right. I couldn't help smiling at that. Not because it was funny, but because nobody had talked about making things right until consequences showed up. Respect had apparently become much more valuable once lawyers entered the conversation. Over the next several weeks, crews worked on my property almost every day. The damaged tree line was carefully restored. Mature native trees were brought in to accelerate privacy recovery. Temporary screening structures were installed between planting zones. New irrigation systems were added at HOA expense. Every step required my approval before work could continue. It was amazing how respectful everyone became once boundaries were clearly established. Meanwhile, things were changing uphill too. One by one, the cameras disappeared from their old locations. New mounts were installed farther inside the neighborhood. Viewing angles were adjusted. Equipment that once stared directly toward my land now focused only on HOA roads and common areas. Apparently, their definition of security had become significantly more precise. About a month later, I received a formal letter signed by the entire HOA board. It wasn't a legal admission of wrongdoing, of course. Their attorneys would never allow that. But between the carefully chosen words and the expensive stationery, the message was obvious. They knew they had crossed a line. More importantly, they knew they had underestimated the person standing on the other side of it. Life gradually returned to normal. Winter arrived. Then spring. The replacement trees began taking root. New growth appeared where chainsaw cuts once scarred the landscape. By early summer, the property felt alive again. One evening I found myself sitting on the back patio watching the sunset spill across the valley. The same valley that had started this entire mess. The same valley people had been so desperate to see that they convinced themselves they had a right to alter someone else's property. As I sat there, I thought about Emily. She would have laughed at the whole thing. Not because it was funny, but because she always understood people better than I did. She used to tell me that most conflicts aren't really about what they're about. They're about entitlement, ego, fear, control. Looking back, I think she would have been right about this one too. The trees were never the real issue. The view wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that a group of people slowly convinced themselves that money gave them permission. Permission to interfere. Permission to decide. Permission to ignore a property line when it became inconvenient. The fence still stands today. People ask me that all the time. Did you ever take it down? The answer is no. Maybe someday I will. Maybe I won't. The truth is the fence stopped being a response a long time ago. Now it's simply a reminder. Not a reminder for me. A reminder for everyone. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. Ownership matters. A few months after everything ended, I ran into Victor Langley at a local charity fundraiser. It was the first time we'd spoken face-to-face since the dispute. He looked uncomfortable from the moment he saw me. We exchanged a few polite words. Then, after an awkward pause, he surprised me. I handled that situation badly, he said quietly. There was no audience. No attorneys. No board members. Just two men standing near a buffet table. For a second, I almost didn't know what to say. Finally, I nodded and replied, "Yeah, you did." He laughed. I laughed. And strangely enough, that was the end of it. Not every story needs a villain dragged away in handcuffs. Sometimes the most satisfying ending is much simpler. Sometimes it's watching people discover that the rules apply to them too. But here's the question I've wondered about ever since. If I had never hired the surveyor, if I had never called the lawyer, if I had never built that fence, would they have restored a single tree? Would those cameras still be pointed at my house today? I honestly don't know. And that's why I still tell this story. Because some people think the fence was revenge. Others think it was self-defense. Some say I should have sued for more. Others think I should have accepted the original trimming payment and moved on. So now I want to hear from you. If your neighbors cut your trees because they wanted a better view, what would you have done? Would you have built the fence? Filed a lawsuit? Accepted the apology? Or do you think I took things too far? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoy real property rights battles, HOA conflicts, and stories where ordinary people stand their ground without breaking the law, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes good fences make good neighbors, because sometimes they really do.